I thought I would just start with a little introduction about myself and Caron, because I'm not sure. Yeah, I know that we're coming from all over the country, I guess. And so my name is Cory Trevena. I am a senior director of education at Caron Treatment Centers. And at Caron Treatment Centers is a substance use treatment center that probably one of the oldest in the country, next to Hazelden Betty Ford, if you've heard of them. We have a residential center in a little town called Warnersville, Pennsylvania. One of those, if you blink, you will probably miss the one traffic light that we have. And then we also have a longer term residential treatment center in Florida, South Florida. We also have recovery centers in New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta. So we're sort of based on the East Coast. One of the things that I always like to highlight about Caron is our intentional focus on prevention and education efforts. So for a treatment center, that's pretty unusual. We have the largest prevention department of any and outreach of any treatment center in the country. And through that, we do, that includes a lot of, elementary through college age prevention focused in, school-based and community-based events and services, as well as a lot of services for families. So helping people and programming for children impacted by a loved one's substance use disorder is something near and dear to my heart, and something that we've been doing at Caron for, I think, my gosh, I've been at Caron for 16 years. So I think for over 10 years ago, we started a program that is specific to children who have been impacted by a loved one's substance use disorder. And we've grown that program from a one-day experience that happened in Caron Warnersville at our residential center to now we offer monthly groups that are, we've been doing them virtually. So a 4-week session for children. We've been offering that every other month. Soon, hopefully we will bring kids back to our campus, but we also offer this program in our regional recovery centers. So it's a great program, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it's a great program for children to learn that they are not alone in dealing with substance use in their family, that it's not their fault, and to learn some coping skills to help them take care of themselves, which is part of those trauma-informed strategies that we're going to talk about today. So that's just a little bit about myself. So with that, I am going to just check the chat. Okay, everything looks good there. So I want to, I'll start just by sharing quickly our objectives for this morning. I'm not an expert with Zoom. I hope that this will be semi-experiential in that I'm going to ask some questions for you to think internally and kind of evaluate your own feelings. It's not as interactive as I would like if we were in person. There's a lot more that we can do, that I like to do with audiences and participants, to really demonstrate some of what it's like to be part of a family that's dealing with substance use. But for today, we will start by deconstructing the definition of addiction as a disease. Then we'll talk a little bit more about understanding life inside a family that's dealing with harmful substance use. We'll talk about some of the consequences that come from growing up in that kind of environment. And then what can we do to support children who are struggling with these kinds of issues in their families, in their family environment. So that's our plan for the next hour and a half. I will continue to monitor the chat. Feel free to post any questions in there, but also feel free to take yourself off of mute and interrupt me and stop me. You know, if we were in person, you'd be able to raise your hand or just interrupt. And I am really open to all of that. I do like having more interaction. So don't hesitate to stop me if I just am kind of talking and you have a question about something that you'd like to have answered. So let's just jump right in. So I want you to think a little bit about the following kind of questions or these should really be statements. Some statements to ponder. So number one, a loving caregiver never uses substances. Do you think that's true? Do you think that's false? Number two, we can't help a child who's impacted by a loved one's substance use until that person stops using substances. Do you think that's true or false? Number three, probably the one that's most important to me, is if a substance user loved their children enough, they would stop using substances. Do you find that to be true or false in your opinion? I see some responses. I definitely think, I'll say there's no right or wrong answers, and that these are just our opinions. And for many people in the broader community, I think we're probably a little bit biased, anyone who's part of this conference, but in the broader community, there are some people who really feel that there is truth to those statements. And so what I like to do in terms of education is just get people to think about them a little bit deeper, a little bit more about their own preconceived notions and experiences with substance use, so that maybe we can move the needle a little bit towards less stigma, less shame around substance use in the family. So let's talk a little bit about what addiction is, primarily because I think how we view a condition impacts how we treat those people who are affected by that condition. So if we look at addiction as a moral failing, we treat people in a way that makes it clear that we have those judgments about them. I come from a treatment center where addiction and substance use disorder is viewed as a disease and a medical condition that is treatable. It's a chronic medical disease, and it involves the brain. It involves brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. That's the technical definition from the American Society of Addiction Medicine. But I'm always surprised when I'm out again in the broader public talking about addiction as a brain disease, how many people still struggle with that concept, that it's not really a true medical disease. People struggle with the idea that there's a choice. And yes, there was a choice at one point in time for someone to use a substance. But at some point, it changed from choices to becoming a disease. And that's the part that we have to help people understand a little bit more, that it's very complex. It's not as simple as somebody makes a choice to use alcohol or somebody makes a choice to use heroin and become an addict or a person with substance use disorder. If there's a lot going on behind the scenes in their brain, in what happens, in their genetics, what's happening to them outside the world, and their own perceptions of that. So I just always, start this by talking about just in general, what is a disease? And a medical disease is really characterized by a defect in an organ system that produces a consistent pattern of signs and symptoms. So with cancer and with diabetes and with COPD or any other disease that we have accepted as a disease, we know that there's a consistent pattern of signs and symptoms, and we can see them. The problem with addiction is that it's often kept silent, it's often hidden, it's often surrounded by these shameful feelings that people have. So we don't always see the consistent pattern of signs and symptoms, but when you start to pull that apart, it becomes very, very clear that it is very characterized by a clear set of symptoms that happens for everyone with that substance, with this diagnosis of substance use. So we know that with all treatable chronic medical diseases, that medical diseases are treated, they're not cured. They're characterized by periods of relapse and remission. You know, if you have diabetes, your outcome depends on the care that you receive over time. You know, you don't go to the doctor and receive a diagnosis of diabetes and they tell you, good luck, you're on your own, stop eating sugar and you'll be fine, and see you later. And then, you know, if somebody leaves and has cake in the next month, we don't chastise them and tell them what an awful person they are. But if someone comes to treatment and they have a substance use disorder and they make some efforts, but they have a drink, you know, a few weeks later, we tell them, you can't come back to treatment, or you're a terrible person, you've failed, and we shame them. So there's differences in the way that we tend to treat some, you know, people with substance use disorder. And then in medical disease, in general medical disease, we know that that the genetics plus the environmental factors determine your vulnerability. And so all of these definitions or these components of medical disease are true for addiction as well. So what happens is in the brain, and I'm not going to go into too much of the science, but just a little piece, because I find it personally fascinating. You know, we have basically our brain is incredibly adaptable to our life experiences. And we really have learned this through, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, but through the adverse childhood experience study and all of the trauma work that was done. We have learned how the brain is so adaptable to the experiences that are happening in a person's environment. But when you combine that with their genetic predisposition, it creates changes. Whatever your life experience is, there are going to be changes in your receptors and the neurotransmitters and your chemical reactions. And we could go into great detail about that. We're not going to, but we know that there's rewiring of nerve connections. And so, you know, at Caron, and this isn't just at Caron, but I think in science, they talk about the neurons that fire together, wire together. So when you start to pair things together, you rewire and prune your brain in a certain way that leads to a change in expression, in the way that your genes are actually expressed, that cause some vulnerability to addiction. And that's called epigenetics. And I think the reason that I find this so fascinating is I you know, 20 plus years ago, when I was in college, I took a fair number of courses on genetics. My degree is in psychology, but I had a minor in science, in biology. So at that point in time, you know, this was in the 90s, nobody was talking about this phenomenon called epigenetics at that point in time, at least not in my coursework. Epigenetics is really fairly a new concept in understanding how much the environment plays into that. And so no longer are we talking about like which came first, the chicken or the egg. It's really the mold of the two of them together. So our brain is really set up in a way that allows us to survive. Right. So we have, you know, we might engage in certain survival activities like eating and drinking water and having sex so that we can procreate. We have these survival activities that cause dopamine to be released. And dopamine is that neurotransmitter that, that gives us that sense of pleasure. That really impacts our memory center of the brain. So dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters that's very involved in the creation of memories. And that leads to a motivation to repeat it. What happens is that motivation to repeat can become compulsive because we like the dopamine release we feel, we like the pleasure, and then that gets wired to positive memory. And the cycle just keeps going and going. And we need that for food, and we need that for procreation, and we need that to survive as a species. But when drugs of abuse come into play and work on this same system, this dopaminergic system, we find that it also becomes this pattern of a motivation to repeat despite any harmful consequences. So there's lots of substances that can be associated with dopamine release. But what I really want you to take from this is that there's also a lot of behaviors that are associated with dopamine release. So not just the survival activities, but things like food and sugar intake. You may know of people who have food addiction, sex and love. There's people that have sex addiction. There's people, just taking care of others can lead to that dopamine release. Gambling, exercise, achievement, collection, which would be the hoarding. When we talk about people who hoard, that can lead to that dopamine release as well. Some people become addicted to rage and violence and media and entertainment. All of those things lead to dopamine release. And I share that because what has become known about the dopamine reaction in the brain is, if you look at this, and I'm not going to go through all the different pieces, but what you really see on the left is the dopamine response to food and sex. And so we're talking about a scale of about the concentration that's measured in basal dopamine output of 200 at the highest for sex, which most people will say is something that's extremely pleasurable. When you look at it on the right, the amphetamine response, we're looking at, on that same scale, a reaction of, or a dopamine release of 1100. Nicotine is above 200, almost at 250. So we see that drugs of abuse, or substances that cause these dopamine levels, cause them in such extreme magnitude that they far outweigh anything that natural rewards can provide for us. And that's part of what causes this disease in some people. And so what we see is that over time, for people who have a substance use disorder, their brain naturally begins to produce less dopamine. In the scan on the right of the screen here, we can see the orange spots that are lit up in the image are where are high concentrations of dopamine. That's a healthy person, and that's all happening in your limbic area and kind of your brainstem. And then on the right-hand side, we see that there's a lot less of that orange being lit up, because that's someone whose brain has been impacted by the use of substances. So they are no longer producing dopamine naturally. So therefore, they don't feel good when they're not using substances. Their ability to experience pleasure is reduced because they don't have enough dopamine. So they start to use substances just to increase their dopamine levels back to normal. And that's the process involved in tolerance, which really becomes important in understanding how this all plays into the medical definition of a disease, because these changes become persistent over time. So this scan, and I think this is the last scan that I have to show you, is a picture, an image of a normal brain, nice, healthy, lots of areas lit up by dopamine. Here we have someone who's used cocaine, and they're 10 days abstinent. They don't have any cocaine in their system. Without the dopamine lit up, they have such small yellows, no orange. They are feeling absolutely awful, 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 awful. And then 100 days, so 3 months, we're starting to see the brain rebuild and fix itself, but it is slow. They are, this is almost 3 months later, and we're still not seeing someone feel good, which is why in treatment, we talk to patients a lot about other ways to try to boost their dopamine levels through healthy exercise, healthy eating, healthy sleeping, healthy natural relationships, but it also is why some people seek out, men and women seek out romantic relationships, because that's something that can increase your dopamine and make you feel better. So when you're coming from a position where you feel absolutely awful, you're just looking for anything to make you feel better. We also have medications that can help with that now, as well, that are kind of approved and okay in the use of substance use to help people start to feel better. But that first year, the brain is just trying to come back to some sort of normalcy. I would say some sort of feeling of homeostasis, really. So I just really like to make it clear what parts of the brain are impacted by all of this. We were sort of talking generally about dopamine, but I think it is important because when you think about someone who has substance use concerns, somebody who's using substance use, you see the different areas and how they're affected. So the brainstem controls functions critical, and I'm sorry, it looks a little fuzzy on this screen, on my screen. I don't know if it is on yours, but the brainstem controls your survival, heart rate, breathing, all of those kinds of things that you need. So we see when people are using substances, their respiration might decrease or increase, their heart rate increases or decreases, blood pressure, all of those things. That's because that's an area that's highly impacted by the substances. But then that limbic system, that's where all those rewards are. That's where your kind of base emotions, the emotional center of your brain is located. Sleep is located, your sleep center is located there. Memory creation is all in that limbic system. I had a medical director that used to call that the monkey brain. So, without any thinking, it's just reaction to external, your natural maybe reaction without any thought, because the cerebral cortex is where all of the thought happens. And that area kind of gets hijacked as well by the lack of dopamine. So when the limbic system is flooded with dopamine, your cerebral cortex is no longer signaling things like, hey, stop, slow down, this isn't good for you anymore, because your limbic system is so lit up and feeling so good that any thoughts that tell you that this behavior is dangerous or hurtful to someone else, all of those reasoning and problem solving skills that we have when we're not under the influence, they're all kind of hijacked and not talking to the limbic system anymore, because it's so strong. When you see the dopamine response of 1100, the basal dopamine output at that level, you see why it becomes hijacked. So again, why are we talking about this? Why am I talking about all of this when we're talking about the children? I do think it's because there's a lot of stigma that goes around substance use disorder. When I work with people who have to then kind of work with the parents who have the substance use disorder, I will sometimes hear such negative judgment towards the parents who are struggling with that substance disorder, that they're bad parents, they're bad people. And we really teach that people with a substance use disorder are not bad people trying to become good, but they are sick people with a disease who are just trying to become well. And unfortunately, some of the children and other family members in the home are dealing with the issue, the whole issue. And that's why we call it a family disease. Everyone is dealing with it because of what this one person is experiencing as the disease, but the whole family is suffering. And it's really just people who are sick becoming well. So now let's talk about how this does impact families as a whole. One of the statistics that has been put out there over and over again since I started in the field is that 1 in 4 children under the age of 18 is impacted by the adverse effects of a parent abusing alcohol or drugs. I think personally, that's a little bit low because of the stigma, because of the shame, because of how that statistic has been derived. I think that there's a lot more children impacted, but that's still 25% of kids impacted by the adverse effects of someone that they love, a parent that they love, abusing alcohol or drugs. So this is affecting a lot of the children in our families. So I do think it's important for us to really understand then what a family dealing with addiction looks like, because again, with the stigma, I think there are different ideas about what families going through this might look like. The reality is, on the outside, what we might see from the outside is a family from any range of socioeconomic status. There is really no, I'll say this again, but there's no discrimination. Money doesn't keep you or protect you from having a substance use disorder. This is not just a poor family disease. This is a family that affects people from all socioeconomic statuses, all races, all religions, all cultures. You can have a family that's very close, and I'll show my age, like a very close looking, like maybe a Leave It to Beaver type of family. Or you could have a family that looks very dysfunctional, like the family on Shameless. They could be intact, separated, divorced. Basically, what this comes down to is that there's no way of knowing from the outside what a family might be experiencing. And we know that the substance use disorders don't discriminate. But on the inside, what's really happening for families is that their daily life is chaotic and unpredictable. Families don't know what to expect. Children don't know what to expect when they come home. They might have their parent there who is passed out on the sofa, or they might have a parent who is not home because they're out at the bar. They might be worried that parent is going to come home and pick fights and arguments, and it's going to become aggressive or violent. There's often an unspoken family rule of don't talk about this. We don't share. It's nobody else's business. It's all, because of that stigma, we're not going to put that out there. Don't trust. You can't trust me because I break promises all the time. If I'm the person who has a substance use disorder, I'm not dependable. My substance use might get in the way of something I promised for you. And don't feel. Stuff it all down. Don't show that you have any emotions or feelings about this. And these, nobody's saying this out loud, but kids are learning this. They're watching, and this is what they learn. In these families, children often grow up faster than what's typical. They are the ones, we have older children taking care of younger children. So they take on these adult responsibilities. They clean up after their parent who's using a substance because they have to keep the house looking together. They take care of their things, their responsibilities at school. They take just on these extra responsibilities and often grow up really fast. They put their inner child aside, and they grow up very fast. They might feel shame about what's going on. My parents aren't the same as everyone else's parents. It might feel like there's a lot of fear, conflict at home. And there's a lot of efforts being made to rescue the person who's using substances, because at the end of the day, that's someone that they love and care about so much. So in all of that love, they're trying to protect the person that they love. I like to use an analogy, or we like to use an analogy of looking at this like your family member who's using the substances is on a lake that's been covered over with ice. And you don't know, some spots might be thick, some spots might be thin. It's very dangerous out there. The whole thing could crack at some point in time and the person could fall in. And you're just watching them out there trying to navigate this pond or this lake that's been covered over with ice. So you're watching from the sidelines and you're wondering, do I go out after them and try to save them? Do I stay here and protect myself? What do I do? You know, what questions do you have if you're someone who loves one of these family members who's using substances? I'm sure you've felt similar feelings like, I don't know, maybe I should be out there with them. But if I go out, now my weight's on the ice and we might both fall in together. So just keep that analogy in mind as I show.
What do children of parents struggling with an addiction experience when the family is focused on the behavior of the substance? To understand this, let's look at the thin ice analogy again. This is the person struggling with substance use standing on thin ice. Her partner decides to try to help her back to the shore by stepping onto the ice. This house seems like a house.
So it seems like you're not hearing the sound. I'm thinking that is because I have my earbuds in. So, oops. Let's try this again.
This house seems like a house where a typical family lives. Let's take a look inside. The mother has a substance use disorder, and the father does all he can to help her stop her addictive behavior. Often he is too focused on the mother's substance use to give much attention to his child. So his child, who's about 6 years old, tries to take on the responsibilities of looking after the home. What do children of parents struggling with an addiction experience when the family is focused on the behavior of the substance user? To understand this, let's look at the thin ice analogy again. This is the person struggling with substance use standing on thin ice. Her partner decides to try to help her back to the shore by stepping onto the ice. He is so focused on saving the woman that he doesn't realize that his child is left alone on the bank of the pond and is exposed to danger. In these situations, the child is alone, confused, unhappy, and unable to understand why her parents aren't paying attention to her. The child wants to be with her parents. She is not aware of risk when she walks on the thin ice to join her parents. Her parents know the child's life, as well as theirs, may be in danger, but the father's focus is on getting his partner off the ice. This is what happens when children impacted by a loved one's substance use get involved in helping the family member who is using substances. They tend to take over the parents' responsibilities in an attempt to ease the stressful situation at home. However, children are too young to fully understand the situation. As a result, it impacts their mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being. Now, with the family standing on the thin ice, all their lives are in danger until an experienced rescuer arrives to help. When the family member struggling with substance use gets professional help, the rest of the family members can focus their attention to the well-being of themselves and the children.
So hopefully that just reinforced a little bit of what I was already saying. And again, some of the information that I shared already really comes from this idea of the adverse childhood experiences study. And so I won't go into a lot of detail on this particular study. It's groundbreaking. I think a lot of people know about it, but what we do know is that substance use by a parent is one of those areas of trauma that a child may experience when they're younger. That's considered kind of this intense childhood stress, along with physical, psychological, sexual abuse, emotional and physical neglect, loss of a parent for any particular reason, whether they're incarcerated or whether they're just estranged due to their substance use, a mother treated violently, so domestic violence, mental illness, and criminal behavior. So what we know with substance use is that some of these other things go along with it, which increase the number of adverse childhood experiences a person might have. From this, they found that 2/3 of the population experience at least one form of abuse or neglect when growing up in their history. And so if you looked at this list and evaluated yourself in terms of what you experienced as a child, there's a good chance that 2/3 of us on this call, and again, because we're skewed and all here and committed to families and supporting families, my guess is it would be a little bit higher for us. So the bottom line, though, the framework that came out of this huge study was that these adverse childhood experiences, having them, experience them, creates a change in the neurodevelopment, which we already talked about. But that then leads to, this prefrontal cortex changing in the way that it reacts. So our social, emotional, and cognitive cognitive functions are impaired, and we then engage in some risky behavior. We see this through the teen years, as kids who are at risk and have experienced multiple adverse childhood experiences now become teenagers who are engaging in their own risky behaviors. And that continues into adulthood, which leads to disease, disability, social problems, and ultimately ends in early death. Another way of saying, or, other studies that have shown this have shown that a lot of times we're looking at kind of 4 as being this cutoff for making drastic differences in terms of disease. So children or individuals who have had experienced 4 or more of those adverse childhood experiences are at greater risk of developing, you can see 1.6 times greater for diabetes, 1.9 for cancer, 2.2 times greater risk for heart disease, and 3.9 times greater for lung disease. We also know that that's true for alcoholism, and that they are at a significantly increased risk for becoming substance users themselves when having experienced 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. So there's a quote that I love to kind of frame these childhood experiences, which really just says, quite routinely, what were initially normal reactions. That's the part that I love about this quote. It was normal to react and adapt to the environment. It was actually healthy for a person to react and adapt to the environment in that way, because the environment was abnormal and there were recurring traumatic circumstances and experiences. But over the long term, it becomes problematic because our survival defenses, the things that make us able to react and adapt, that fight or flight or freeze, those responses are incompatible with a less dangerous or stressed life. So they become problems later when you take those threats away. And we don't know how to function without those threats because we're so used to that. That's what feels comfortable in our life, is being hyper aroused to deal with a very stressful life experience, which leads to this intergenerational continuity, So a lot of times people will ask me, why is someone who was a child of an alcoholic, why would they marry an alcoholic? Because that's what feels normal. That's what feels comfortable. That's what our brains are adjusted and know how to adapt to. And it's uncomfortable when that's not there, because what we know, how we know how to relate to other people has all been learned at a young child, as a young child. So in terms of substance use, the substance use disorder, often shortened to SUD, the impact on the whole family, it has relational impacts, financial, emotional, physical, and spiritual. We know that in terms of relational, we know that there's children who they might have loss of friends or feel isolated from other kids because they are afraid to bring people home to their house. Because they don't know what they'll find or what the situation will be like at home. So they don't have friends over. We know that there's a financial cost because the person who's using substances might miss work or just engage in careless spending, or the cost of therapy itself. We know the cost of treatment is astronomical for quality treatment, and insurance companies don't always pay and reimburse well for treatment. So even just getting better makes a huge financial cost on the family. The emotions, that go through are typically all negative. There's just a barrage of negative emotions associated within a family where there's substance use. And then that hopelessness, that despair, loss of faith, loss of dignity that comes in a family and for children growing up with substance use disorder. The questions of, why would God let this happen to me? We hear from children all the time. And of course, physical costs as well. I think it also is worth noting that there are nearly 6 million children living in a household maintained by a grandparent. I was kind of floored when I saw that statistic, and almost half of them are under the age of 6. So, again, missing parents not involved in the raising of their children. In a study that looked at the foster care system between 2014 and 2018, saw significant increases in the foster care system, and a significant number of those kids that are taken out of their home or living with grandparents are because of substance use issues by a parent. So the family reacts to this person with substance use disorder in so many different ways, and it's not necessarily the same by every person, and it's actually not even the same on any day by any one of the individuals in the family. Sometimes we're going to confront the loved one, and sometimes we're going to avoid talking about it. Sometimes we might go into a caretaking role where we're trying to fix everything, and sometimes we just get paralyzed with fear and worrying. Sometimes our time might be spent investigating, what in the heck is this person doing? They didn't come home tonight. Where are they? What are the emails? What are, checking emails, checking phones, trying to find out where this person is and what they're doing, or what they did do when they were out, or even just, we don't trust them now that they are trying to live a life of sobriety, and we no longer trust them because that trust was eroded. We might try to control the situation. There's a lot of different reactions, but none of them are really healthy reactions when in the long run, when we talk about family relationships. So In terms of specifics, when it comes to children in the in the age group between 6 and 11-year-olds, some of the things that that we see at that developmental stage is that that child is really worried about the health of the addicted parent. Like I said at the start of this, I oversee a department that does early prevention, does a lot of early prevention lessons for children in schools. And even at that age, we hear a lot of kids coming up to us afterwards worried about if we talk about nicotine use, cigarette smoking, and kids so worried about the health of their parent who might be smoking. It's also true for if they're using other substances. They're incredibly worried about the health of their parent. They don't want to lose their parent. They're angry, they're upset about the lack of predictability in their house. They're starting to compare themselves and see what other families are dealing with. Prior to this, it's just kind of normal. They didn't know that there might be other families that do things differently. That's all they know between 0 and 5. But once they go into school and see other kids, now they see, wow, this is a situation, mine is not like the rest. And so they become angry and upset by that. They worry about the fighting that happens at home. They are upset and embarrassed by inappropriate behavior. So they don't want their parent to go to parent-teacher conferences because they don't know what to expect from their loved one when they show up. They're really upset about all the broken promises, and they feel like it's their fault. They feel like they're not worthy, and that if the person, the question I asked at the beginning, if the person loved them enough, they would stop the substance use, they would stop this behavior. And they feel responsible for trying to control their parents' drinking. And as they grow developmentally, that changes a little bit. So instead of being so much concerned about their parents' health, now they're concerned about their own vulnerability to this disease. And will they become an alcoholic if they decide to ever drink? They want to know those things. What's the risk for them? They're concerned about, they are still concerned about their parents' health, but they want to know, how can they make their parents stop? They're concerned about divorce and separation in their parents' relationship. And they're concerned, just about how this will look to the outside world, how this looks to their friends and their friends' parents who see their family that might be a little dysfunctional. So they start hiding what's going on within their own family. So with all of this said, I think it's pretty clear that these kids absolutely need our help. They are at risk of their own emotional, physical, and learning problems, their own behavioral health issues. Depression is high among kids with family members using substances, suicide attempts, eating disorders, kind of the desire to control something in an environment where they feel totally like everything's out of control. Re-victimization, sort of that, again, that goes to that cycle of intergenerational trauma and placing themselves in situations where they're likely to be re-victimized, and then their own substance use disorder development in themselves. So there's a lot of concerns for these kids that show that we absolutely need to be, as adults in their lives, be able to help them. And so we really want, the key message is, if there's nothing else that you can take from them, take from this presentation, I would say if you can take these messages and take them back to the children that that are experiencing substance use disorders in their family, and you can help them to understand that they're not alone. That's our biggest thing that we hear from kids, is that they, particularly when they come to our program, that is focused on these kids, the one thing they say is over and over again, I thought I was the only one. now I see that there's other kids who are experiencing what I'm experiencing, and we help them to try to understand they should not feel any shame because they didn't do anything to cause this. And it's a disease. It's and they have a sick parent, just like, no one would feel shame if their parent had cancer. And it's not their fault. They didn't cause it and they shouldn't try to fix it. So those are the key messages that are really impactful for all children who who have struggled with these issues in their home. But in terms of even deeper than that, if we have the opportunity, we do, we can create this sort of trauma-informed framework of care, really, that looks at helping to create safety for them, for us to be trustworthy and transparent. We can utilize peer support in that framework of care. We can collaborate and empower children and families, and we can recognize our own biases in all of this. So I'm going to go through those a little bit more deeply, but starting with the first one, in terms of helping to create safety. How can we do that? Well, we can talk and have conversations with kids and help them role play. What will you do if your parent who's using substances is under the influence and wants you to get into the car? How will you respond? Role play that for them. Help them to come up with language that they feel comfortable with to say, I'm not going to get in the car with you right now. That's a very scary thing for a child to say to their parent, who, when their parent is supposed to be the parent, and they now have to put that boundary in place. What will you do when you come home and your parent is passed out on the sofa or in bed? What's your plan for that situation? How will you eat? How will you, do you have younger siblings in the home you have to take care of? What are the things that you can do? Who are the people that you can reach out to in order to get support? What will you do if things become aggressive in the house and you're worried about violence? Can you call the police? Can you call a trusted adult? Who is that person? So those are all of the things that we can help talk to children about, because at the end of the day, we can't fix their situation at home. Typically, we don't have that kind of power, but we can help them cope with the situation and make sure that they're safe. I think it's also really important that we be completely trustworthy and transparent. So we have to be reliable. These kids are so used to broken promises that, if we are the ones breaking a promise to them, it might just roll off their shoulders. It might not seem like it's important to them, like, oh, you canceled on me, or we were supposed to meet after school, or I was supposed to come to your house, but now, you canceled or you didn't show up. And they may brush that off, but that's something that, is it kind of another added layer of trauma of one more person that they can't count on. So we need to be those people that show up for them, that they can count on, that they can trust. And we need to be transparent. So depending on your role, if you are a counselor working with these kids, I think it's always important up front to let them know, and counselors would know this, but let them know what can be kept between the two of you in conversation and what you might have to tell somebody else about. So we can talk about how you're feeling, but if you tell me that you're at risk of being hurt, I'm going to have to report that to somebody else to keep you safe. I think being clear and upfront and transparent about that it establishes that container for the relationship of boundaries of what is okay and what's not. We like to use this acronym LOVE, LOVEE, which is listen, so we need to talk less, listen more, observe, and just watch how the children that we're talking to are feeling, validate their feelings, like, yeah, this really stinks. This is hard. This is hard work to love a parent who's who's struggling with a substance use disorder. We can educate them about the disease, and let them know that this is not their fault and that their parent is just sick. And we can empower them to take care of themselves, to communicate how they're feeling, empower them through giving them coping skills that will help them deal with their situation. Teach them to differentiate between their loved one and the disease. So you can love that person and just hate how they behave when they're under the influence of the substances. You can hate the disease, but love the person. And we use this all of the time. I think we have this printed and laminated all over our rooms where we work with kids impacted by substance use. This comes from the National Association of Children of Alcoholics, and it's called the 7 C's, which is: I didn't cause it, I can't cure it, I can't control it, but I can help take care of myself by communicating my feelings, making healthy choices, and celebrating me. So our programs are really geared around teaching this. We infuse this into everything we do, helping kids to understand that they didn't cause it and they're not responsible. All the things that we've already talked about here today. And then focused on how do they take care of themselves? How do they make healthy choices for themselves? How do they celebrate their success in the situation that they're in? And we teach them a lot of self-care with that. They need to find ways to care for their mind, body, emotions, and spirit. So do they journal? Older kids, we talk to them about journaling. We talk to them about exercising. We talk to them about how they handle their emotions and communicate their emotions. We've already talked about identifying safe people, but how to problem solve. And I do see a question here about how do you navigate your language to where it doesn't come across as talking bad about the parent. I think it goes back to helping them to say, your mother or father is sick. They're not a bad person, but because they're sick, you have some extra things to think about or responsibilities that you didn't have, that maybe some of your friends don't have because they don't have a sick parent. But and you cannot like the way that they behave when they're using substances, but you still love them. They are still your mother, your father at the end of the day. They just are sick people who are stuck in this disease. I really think it comes back to reinforcing that message. And it's hard. And that's where, we'll talk about recognizing your own biases in all of this when you're talking to them. How can you make sure that if you are feeling like that person is a bad parent, making bad decisions for their children, how do you keep that from coming through to the child? Because that we definitely don't want the child to feel like their parent is a bad person. They're just sick. Here, I think, is a resource that we like to use that was created by one of our family therapists. So I'm going to show this quickly so that I think has some good messaging in it. And if anybody is interested in this, they can certainly take my name and information, and I can share with you the video, and I can share with you the story itself.
This is the tale of a blue lizard named Sud, who was funny and smart and sweet, but he had no tail, so he was discontent and awkward on his feet. When one day he noticed his friends at play were eating a special bean, which made them able to jump up high, he thought, "That's just what I need." But when Sud ate the bean, it was odd, for he did not just jump high. He turned into a bright blue dragon. He couldn't just jump, he could fly. He was strong, powerful, ferocious, and quick. He breathed fire and was unafraid. However, he caused wreckage wherever he went. He hurt anyone who played. By the end of the day, its spell wore off, and back into a lizard he turned. His friends were confused and hurt, but he swore to them he had learned. He thought about being a dragon again. Being so powerful and fast, he tried the bean once more, but sadly for Sud, he still had a fiery blast. This time, when the spell wore off, he was sick and his feet were sore. When he looked to check them out, he saw that his toes were no more. Now he moved slower than ever. He felt awkward, alone, and lame. He needed the bean just a little so he could function and not be ashamed. Sud took the bean again and again. He would always crash and fall. It caused nothing but chaos and pain. He couldn't control it at all. Soon his legs vanished, and he was a snake. He felt totally broken and beat. He hated himself for what he had done, and desperate to grow back his feet. Poor Sud did not know that the bean, which made other lizards jump high, would affect him in a different way, become a dragon obsessed with the sky. Now a serpent, he begs for the bean, for he dreams of fire and flight, but needs the bean just to slither, because without it, he has no might. One day Sud saw a blue lizard. He was also missing a tail, but he moved and danced and laughed. He wasn't awkward or frail. This lizard had the same story as Sud. He had been a snake and a fiend, but he had turned back into a lizard, and he no longer needed the bean. Sud was told that there was a solution and that he was not all alone, but he had to open up his heart and be willing to be shown. So Sud worked hard like his friends. He learned how to heal and cope, and he turned back into a lizard. Sud's tale is one of hope. He can never eat the bean again if he is to remain free, but he has no desire to be a dragon. I'm content just being me.
So we use that with some of the younger children as a way to explain substance use to them, and have, we do have some resources that go along with how to have that conversation and explain, if it is a parent, that they love some of the different pieces of substance use that are shown in that little story. So I also think using peer support groups is really beneficial. And we happen to call ours Kids of Promise. So Kids of Promise in their own words. I do not know what treatment means. Where are they? What am I not involved? Why am I not involved in the counseling? So a lot of kids don't understand what treatment is. And so we use this opportunity to explain to them that treatment, where they could be involved in counseling and treatment and everything else. So I think that's one benefit of peer support groups. And I did see, I got a little distracted, but I saw in the chat that SUD, SUDS, comes from substance use disorder. Yeah. Also, I had to, another quote, I had to raise myself. I don't know where to begin to continue my education, schedule homework, make appointments, find a job. So peer support allows other kids to share information about how they've managed to navigate. This is obviously for an older teen, but how they managed some of their responsibilities and next steps for their life. Before I was in this group, I thought I was the only one in this kind of situation. Now I realize there are a lot of kids are having the same experience I am having. This is one that we hear over and over and over again. Kids just didn't know that there were other kids out there who might be experiencing the same thing. I don't get to spend time with my loved one. They are always at meetings. They were away for a long time. Now they are home, but I do not matter to them anymore. Things are different, but not good. This one is a sad quote to me because obviously their loved one is trying to get healthy, but in terms of doing that, there are a lot of meeting requirements. There could be outpatient therapy that's happening in the evening. And so, a young child who saw their parent go away for, let's say, 28 days or 30 days, and now they come back, they're so excited to have their parent back. And they thought that there was going to be all of this time that they could spend with their loved one, and yet now their loved one's not home again. And so being able to talk them through that and share some information again about the treatment is helpful with that. I cannot trust anyone. People always say things are going to change, but they never do. Why would things change now that my mom has been to treatment? Also kids being skeptical, worried about whether or not they can trust their parent even when they come back. So those were just a few of different quotes that we've seen from in our groups. But I do love this particular quote: kids don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so in the end, I think really that's the key piece that we need to let these kids see. And I think you'll see that message in this video.
Notice me, smile, ask me about myself, be honest with me, empower me, ask for you to help, make time for me, surprise me, believe in me, show up at my games, listen to me, respect my choices, help me make decisions, listen to my stories, read to me, catch me doing something right, let me act my age, be silly with me, play with me, help me be my best, share a meal with me, build something with me, be happy, ask for my opinion, visit my school, trust me, expect the best.
All those kids want is just for a parent or an adult to show them how much they care. And so in the end, that's the only thing that I think matters to these kids. And then collaborate and empower. So meet people where they're at. I think, and I did see one of the questions about how much is too much information. I'm going to come back to that when we talk a little bit about some of the resources, but yes, so meet people where they're at and share resources with them, whatever part of the process they're in. If the parent is still in active use and they're not ready to get help, recognize that a lot of the kids that come, that get involved in some of these things have a parent who recognizes within themselves that their children still need help, even if they can't help themselves yet. So, recognize where the parents are at and share whatever resources they're open to and willing to accept from you. So I do have a few resources listed, as I showed you the Sud's Tale. An Elephant in the Living Room is an excellent book to share with younger children about experiencing, the not talking about what's going on. We use Think of Wind a lot, which is another great book about watching, and dealing with the environment that you live within. For older kids, there's a book called Understanding the Fall that's a little bit more detailed about addiction. So when it comes to how much information is appropriate to share with children, I think you really have to evaluate the child's development level and speak to them and give them as much as you think that they can manage and understand. So we do talk you know, we have kids in our support groups as young as 7. And we certainly do share more information in groups with the teenagers than we do with the elementary kids, but we are starting to name, you know, we're naming substance use disorder with them. We're explaining it as a disease and kind of helping them to compare it to a disease that they may understand. So we ask them, you know, what's a disease that you've ever heard of? And then we talk about that one and compare substance use to that. You know, as they get older and they can attend, their attention spans a little bit longer, you can go into a little bit deeper conversations. So it really does depend. It really does just depend on their developmental level. I also just wanted to share with you that if you're not aware, Sesame Street has some great resources, and for really, you know, for even younger children, that addresses the addiction crisis. I'm not going to show this particular video. You know, if you look up Sesame Street and addiction, I think you'll find it. It's a great resource for younger children. And then the National Association of Children of Addiction resources, tons of resources for you and things that you can use with children. So I like to always put their information out there because it is a wealth of really good information. And then the last piece of this trauma-informed system of care is really about recognizing your own biases. What's a fact? What's a belief? How do you feel about parents who might be using substances? This is hard work, and it can, even the best of us can feel judgments when we are listening to children, you know, tell their stories and some of the things that they're experiencing and some of the what seems like really horrible things that are happening in their houses and the unpredictability and the chaos. And it's hard to keep it in perspective and remember that the parent is sick. So I think it's really very important, again, to continue to educate yourself and be able to reiterate that addiction is a disease and that person is sick. I think it's important to have your own kind of support system if you are working with these children, so that you also can share, you know, if you're feeling any of those feelings toward a parent. And then I do want to share this. This is a 2-minute video called The Anonymous People. If you haven't seen that, I think this is a great movie. It's a documentary related to the stigma around substance use. So we're just going to watch the trailer because the trailer is really powerful, I think.
Whether we want to admit this or not, this is our Black Plague.
There's 25 million people that suffer from this illness.
We got an epidemic.
The national crisis that untreated addiction cost our economy over $550 billion last year. It's disgraceful that we have done so little about it thus far.
Once you're an addict, you're that thing that they have to have. So many people think of addicts as homeless people living under bridges. The media is difficult for us to battle against because the negative news about addiction is dramatic.
You know what we in the media do? We wink it. We Snoop Dogg it. Hey, oh yeah, they're stoned. That's fine.
If everyone thinks of alcoholism and addiction as a negative thing, no one's going to want to go get help.
As a culture, we are still very rooted in just say no.
Drugs are menacing our society.
We're going to try to incarcerate our way out of the addiction problem.
Our jails are full of addicts and alcoholics. They're all pulled up in one spot.
When you're caught, you will do time.
Recovery is what you need, not prison. Hello?
Alcoholism is too long been a taboo subject.
The shame and secrecy are just as deadly as the disease itself.
Our numbers are unbelievably strong, but yet we have no voice.
We know about every issue out there, but people don't know how important the issue of recovery is.
A person in long-term recovery from an illness that has no cure, but an illness that has a solution.
If we could ever tap those 20 million people in long-term recovery, you change this overnight.
Now it's my turn to teach you that recovery works.
History's on our side. History will show one day who and what we are. So I say we make history.
Voices are out there. We have to find and open the hearts. And I think those hearts want to be open.
I refuse to feel ashamed of who I am. I most certainly will not be embarrassed that I'm an addict. I'm going to tell whoever I damn well want to.
There's a lot of us. Everyone knows somebody.
So I think the more education that and the more advocacy and awareness that we can bring to substance use disorders will help families to heal and people to talk about it so that it is not shameful and kids don't have to suffer in silence. I also, can bring attention. We have a digital learning course on substance abuse impact on the family. That's more of a resource for professionals working with kids, but is free and available as well. And then I included some general resources. So I think we have about 5 to 10 minutes or so if there are any questions, or if anybody wants to share anything, please feel free to take yourself off mute. But otherwise, thank you so much for your attention and allowing me to share this information with you today.
Cory, those were excellent films and videos and graphics and everything. I learned a lot today.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
It was terrific.
Thank you. And please, I'll put my, see if I can go back to the beginning and put my information on the, up on the screen again, so that if you need anything, please feel free to reach out to me. Any resources, if you have any children who are interested in participating in our program, I can connect you to the people who run that. That program right now is at no cost while it's it's virtual, and so it can take in kids from anywhere to participate in the 4-week virtual program. And so if there's anything that I can do, please don't hesitate to reach out.
And Cory, that was anonymouspeople.com, is that right?
Yeah, I believe that's the if you search the anonymous people for that, yes, that's
okay.
Yeah. And then
thank you for all the information. I'm definitely going to get on the website and check out more resources on there. Thank you.
Great. And then somebody just asked me to go back to the last slide for the resources. for the Kit for Kids, Kit for Educators. So thank you all. Thank you very much.